bioethics and taking my concept of the created biology of gender stratification. So I'm hoping that at some point I can, rescue that. In any event, I will try to ad-lib a little bit of the changes that I remember making. So the first thing is sort of an abstract, this one says that the created biology, which will be abbreviated CB in those slides where I didn't have much space, it goes across species and it goes across human history, and I also give you the introduction to actually a couple of theories. So first of all, I draw on my general theory of gender stratification, and I have for some years been playing around with the notion of a created biology of gender stratification. And the first thing I'm going to do here is to compare humans and our two closest relatives with whom we share about 99% of our DNA, bonobos and chimpanzees. Second, I am going to do a quick overview of human history and look at created biology from hunters and gatherers through today. And the third thing is I'm going to take a look at low education United States whites, especially men who've lost good jobs and now suffer from more, quote, diseases of despair, which is essentially very interesting evidence that has just been published in a study by Case and Deaton, where Deaton is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. They are a wife and husband couple. And the fourth thing is that, and also these men unfortunately are now dying sooner. And so this seems to be a new negative and possibly gendered creative biology that is emerging in the United States, Midwest, and beyond. And then the fourth thing is I started to put together an actual theory linking this together with bioethics. So that's the part that is apparently lost in this version of the presentation. I'll see how much time I have that I can try to sort of paste it together. The first thing is an overview of my general theory of gender stratification. And I have been working on this since 1984 when it first came out in the journal Sociological Theory, and they published the whole thing, and it's like 77 or 78 pages. It goes from pages 23 to 101. And in that theory, and ever since, I have been positing that the main and most important source of power that affects the level of gender equality is economic power, and that it is more crucial for women than for men because men have better access to other forms of the 5 major varieties of power. And the 5 major varieties of power are political, the power of force or violence, economic, the power of ideology, and most recently we are discovering the power of information. And when it comes to the power of violence and force, men have a great advantage, including 1/3 to 1/2 more upper body strength than in your monopoly on heavier weapons. When it comes to political power, men have pretty well predominated, although not exclusively. And at the moment, for example, there are 22% women in the Houses of Parliament or Congress in maybe about 180 or 90 countries that report such data. And the average female labor force participation, according to the latest World Bank statistics, is that the average country of those, let's say 190, have an average female labor force participation rate of 53%. And by one statistic, I calculated 55%. That is a huge difference. And we'll see that this is going to be linked ultimately to the created biology of gender stratification, and through that, hopefully, to what I remember of my emerging theory of bioethics. and the created biology of gender stratification. Now, economic power is also important to men, but as I said, they have alternative ways of gaining power for women of these 5 major sources of power. If we can envision a graph that goes from 0 at the bottom to 100 at the top, and if we can envision a line that goes through the middle of it, which I call the 50-50 line, what we will see is that of the 5 major sources of power, the only one where women not infrequently go over 50% control of economic resources is economic power. And a little later on, I will give you an example of both ends. Afghanistan, where I worked in 2011, and the many studies of the colonial Iroquois, a confederation of 6 North American Indian tribes. Let me move on right here. And I have found data on this, and to let you know that this is old, it says 47 nations, and I have already worked in 48 since I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I have been using such things as ethnographic databases, and I have used also my own data. I've used other people's research, and for the material on the U.S. white low education males and what's been happening to them, I've been using a lot of things that were released since Trump won the election on the 8th of November 2016. So let's start with the prerequisite to economic power that runs all across human history to the present, and I will be talking right now about Homo sapiens. And as I mentioned, the evidence on the Homo sapien presence emerging in Africa about 200,000 years ago is now quite good, and this latest study or finding in Morocco would seem to set it back an additional 100 or 110,000 years, although there is a slight difference in skull shape. But it does appear to be a big-brained human, very similar in physiology to ourselves. Okay, so the first thing is the prerequisite to women having economic power is that they must make some contribution to important or key subsistence activities. And without that, they are pretty much off the charts. They are not going to get anywhere near equality with men. All right, but first of all, it's not enough to be a producer or to be important in the key subsistence activities of your society. You have to control some of the means and fruits of production. Otherwise, let's consider it. Slaves, serfs, working people, housewives would long ago have inherited the earth because they are the ones who put in more labor. And so it is not the hours of labor. It is whether you can transform labor, which is the prerequisite for women. Without it, they're going to be very oppressed, okay? If they are basically sitting in the house in seclusion, as I will talk about, it is not going to turn out well with respect to improved gender equality. So how can these women transform their important contributions to subsistence to control over some form of the means and fruits of production, to economic power? And I will talk about that. And I'm also going to start with the fact that one of the factors that helps women control mere work to economic power involves organization. And this brings me to a comparison with bonobos, chimpanzees, and humans, which differ amazingly and dramatically in their level of gender equality. Okay, if using the old 200,000-year date for the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, our species, we can say that 96+% of that roughly 200,000-year history has been spent by us humans as foragers, which is the technical term for hunting and gathering. Okay, and I also would like to mention that bonobos and chimpanzees are equally close to us in terms of DNA. One is not closer than the other, and the overlap is about 99%. Here you see a picture, and you see that chimpanzees have much more sexual dimorphism, meaning the male is significantly larger, heavier, and more muscular than the female. Now look on the left at the bonobos, and you see very little difference, as little as or possibly slightly less than the difference among human, Homo sapien males and females. Okay, and let me get down, I think, to the next slide. And see if I can, and incidentally, I had all of these slides centered, and so something went wrong in the loading of the file as well, because I can see that they're now left justified, so it really is a bit of a mess. Anyway, bonobos and chimps, this is their organization and their levels of male-female equality, where I am citing the primatologist Franz de Waal from his book published in 2005 called Our Inner Ape, where he compares the three species. And it turns out that all three of our species had a common ancestor until sometime between 5.5 and 7 million years ago. Most people would say about 6 point something. And this is when we humans split off from the original common ancestor. And also about 2.5 million years ago, chimpanzees and bonobos split off from the common ancestor, which is now extinct, and they did so on two sides of the Congo River. One is, we'll see, on the north side, on the south side, and this group became bonobos because the south side has a lush environment where it's rich in fruit trees, and that is what bonobos like to eat. On the north side of the Congo River, which was so wide that they lost contact with each other, the chimpanzees evolved, and this was a much harsher environment. It had less rainfall, it was drier and less reliable for rainfall. It had much fewer sources of food. There was not fruit for the picking, and so they evolved rather differently. And the big thing is that amongst bonobos, it is females who are much better organized than males, and in fact they control the food supply. And in my theory, this is analogous to control of economic resources. And then when you add to that, one of the strategic indispensability factors of my theory and how you transform mere work into economic power is by being better organized, by controlling more of the technical means of expertise and a few other variables. Okay, so bonobos, females are better organized than males and control the food supply, equivalent to economic power. Among chimps, the males are more organized than the females. They're also more violent than the females, but they don't control the food supply, and they do not control all of the violence in that group. All right, the bonobos use a particular method to reduce and control friction and avoid contact. It is sexualized contact, and it can range from anything from touching erogenous zones that give pleasure to full-on sexual intercourse, and because they want to keep the peace in their group. This kind of resorting to sexualized touching averages about once every 90 minutes in studies that have been done of both captive and living in the wild bonobos, okay? Now, what they do then is they use any combination of male and female, all ages, and they have many different behaviors. Males seem to prefer rubbing, standing back to back and rubbing their behinds. Females seem to prefer standing face to face and rubbing their genitalia together. Anyway, I did also want to say that they have one taboo in common. Both bonobos and chimps have an incest taboo of mother with their sons. The females will sleep with any other member of the group. Among the bonobos, male, female, any age, but in neither species, neither bonobos nor chimps, will mothers and sons have sexual contact. Anyway, moving on, there are checks and balances on violence among chimpanzees. And their sexual contact averages once every 7 hours, much less frequently than among bonobos. And there have been a few chimpanzee troops that have been studied that have had female leaders, but there has never been a bonobo troop that has been studied that has had a male leader. So much less violence, much more sexuality, much more peace among bonobos. All right, let's move on. And if I go on to humans, we have not kept the same strategy, which is called technically browsing among the great apes. They meander along and pick their food and eat it. We have had 4, and now we're heading for 5. The first one is foraging, more popularly known as hunting and gathering. And until horticulture, done with a hoe, not a plow, began to emerge about 10 to 12,000 years ago, it was the only way in which we made our living. Then, as you'll see, someone in the Middle East invented the plow, an incredible invention, whereas hoe cultivation emerged in many places over the space of just a few thousand years. The plow was apparently invented only once, and it diffused along the 6,000 or so mile width of the Eurasian landmass from the Middle East all the way to the Pacific Ocean, Siberia in the north, and China in the south. And now, so what happened after plow agriculture is capitalism arose, ending a period of technological stagnation as inequality reached its high point in human history. And then this soon led, the rise of capitalism soon led to the emergence of industrial societies about 200 years ago. And now it looks as though we are at the verge of the 5th way we have made our living from this planet, the 5th techno-economic base, which is tentatively called the Information Society, but that is not a definitive name. Let me move on. I'm looking at those 5 bases and the average level of gender stratification, and what we can see is that most hunting and gathering groups, except for a small number among Australian Aboriginals and Eskimos, where there was not much of a gathering season, they were roughly on the 50-50 line. And when we get to cultivation, you will see that today, it started again at the 50-50 line. We have archaeological evidence. Today, however, there is a big group in the middle, most of them living in sub-Saharan Africa with a male kinship and property system, and then is a small group of what I call warrior complex, small groups that fight all the time, very male supremacists with female infanticide, and none of them have ever even gotten to the level of the state. When it comes to agrarian societies, most of them are quite patriarchal, except in Southeast Asia, where we kept the original bilateral kinship system of hunters and gatherers, and kept the original focus of early horticulture on female kin and women's own economic power. And when we get to industrial societies and now possibly information societies, you see at the very bottom countries like Saudi Arabia. You see at the very top places like Scandinavia, the Nordic countries. But none of them have ever achieved the 50-50 line for an entire society. not since these earlier, forms. And in Southeast Asia, it has maintained the highest average level of women's relative position and women's relative economic power. Okay, so hunting and gathering was the world's most usually successful strategy, and it had minimal gender inequality for more than 96% of Homo sapien history using the previous 200,000 year date. The food supply was fluctuating, and it was sometimes scarce. This necessitated sharing, and it turns out to be one of the very few cultural universals that every known hunting and gathering group shared. The ones that did not share did not survive to be studied. And we also have a different subsistence strategy than the bonobos or the chimps or the gorillas or the orangutans, the other great apes. Ours involves a gender division of labor, which they don't have. What we have is the males tend to be the primary hunters, the females tend to be the primary gatherers, which makes males the zoological specialists, the females the botanical specialists, and interestingly enough, plants do not run away. And because of that wonderful quality, it turns out that gathering is easier than hunting, and that except at Arctic or Antarctic latitudes, or in places, well, basically that's it, gathering produces more calories than hunting, and they are more reliable calories. And so with respect to sharing, which I told you was a universal, there are stricter rules on sharing what the men bring back from the hunt than what the women bring back from gathering, because the hunt is less reliable, and when the men are successful, they want to make sure that the sharing is fully equitable, whereas the women tend to have a bit more freedom in allocating what they bring in because it's easier. Now, when it comes to the relative difference in power, in economic power, it's minimal. And as I say, the relative difference among most hunting and gathering groups is also minimal, with a number of groups that have been studied, such as the Kun in southern Africa, in southern Africa, mainly in Botswana and Namibia these days, which have not really shown patterns of gender stratification until contact and until their ways were transformed. Okay, and they were studied early enough by anthropologists that we know what they were like before major contact. And so the less equal ones are in Australia and in the Arctic. Now, the first evidence of gender inequality happens about halfway through the horticultural era. What do I mean by that? For mysterious reasons, one of which was population pressure and the other of which I don't have to go into, but it was not overhunting. We did not kill off all the large animals. A much better theory is another asteroid or meteorite hit in Canada, in southern Canada, the Laurentian ice sheet, when the last ice age was ending, which may have wiped out all the large mammals except for the bison in North America. But basically, we suddenly started to get cultivation, possibly slowly increasing population pressure. Hunters and gatherers had relatively widely spaced fertility. Women gave birth in most studies about 4 years apart. And this meant that the average woman might raise to maturity. Remember that she would lose some children, 2+ children, which would be just enough to make for very, very gradual population growth. And one theory says that it took us until maybe 15,000 years ago to have spread around the earth and come to more or less equal pressure on carrying capacity. And then in some places, humans would try to experiment with the food supply because it was getting a little bit uncomfortable. They felt that they were not having enough of a surplus to ensure their survival, and because women were the primary botanists, the primary gatherers, I believe that all archaeologists give women credit for the development of cultivation. Okay, the so-called, what is wrongly called the agricultural revolution and should be called the horticultural revolution, seems to have been in the hands of women. Now, we have good archaeological evidence going back thousands of years, and there's a very famous dig in Isan, in northeast Thailand, a village called Ban Chang, and this was excavated by a combination of Thai and North American anthropologists. Joyce White was in charge of the project for many years at the University of Pennsylvania, and I went and worked with her on this stuff. I was very interested, and she found evidence of thousands of years of what appeared to be socioeconomic and gender equality. For example, there never were any burials in which more grave goods were in the men's graves than in the women's. They also never had burials for thousands of years with weapons, even though they had metallurgy. They went from copper to bronze to iron without any weapons. And so this starts this whole notion of relatively more peaceful, relatively more egalitarian Southeast Asia. And I can take you through a lot more, but there's no time. Anyway, so the only, let me just take a look. So the only surplus that there was might have been unequally distributed, but in these horticultural societies, which were probably matrilineal in the kinship and property system, nevertheless, if there was any inequality, it was only in surplus. For people to make a living, to have enough to eat, there was no known inequality, and you see no difference in the skeletons that corresponds to a privileged class that is taller and has more robust bones than another group that is emerging. So there is nothing but evidence for equality for thousands of years in some of this archaeology in Southeast Asia. Okay? Is this, can you see all this? All right, so then about midway through the horticultural era, about 7,000 years ago, we start getting changes in the kinship system. Hunters and gatherers have the kinship system of the present-day United States and most of Europe, which is bilateral kinship, where female side relatives, mother's relatives, and father's side relatives are given equal importance and equal weight. This is true of North America, it's true of most of Europe, and apparently was true of all the known hunting and gathering groups that were studied when they were in early phases of contact. But one of the reasons that they went over to a different kinship and property system was the fact that they did not yet have the state, their population was growing. And so what happened was that they would elaborate their kinship system, there would be leaders of the kin group. And initially this seems to have started on the female side, and there's archaeological evidence. But about halfway through, you start seeing more inequality, burial of men with more grave goods. And we know that there was evidence of multiple wives for more prominent men. And the thing that's important is that women were the primary cultivators in most horticultural groups. So if a man could get more than one wife, he could acquire more power. He could accumulate more surplus. And what happened was that they had to change the kinship group from focusing on the female side relatives, because there you can only have monogamy. One man, one woman. The women living together in her village, in the bride's village, would not be very happy if her husband brought in an unrelated female and said, "Darling, I have just married this woman." They would have probably thrown him out. So, but when a man wants to have more wives because they are the primary producers, and this would make him powerful and probably rich, he cannot do it with a matrilineal system. But if you go over to the male side, and the kinship and property system now is calculated through men, then certain men can acquire more than one wife, and they very cleverly then institute an institution called bride price, where younger men have to come up with a lot of goods or resources to get themselves a first and subsequent second wives, and this is how they recruit political followers, telling a young man, if you support me in our council meetings, I will help you get bride price, and you will soon be a rich and powerful man yourself. This is where the kinship system started changing to the male side, and we can see that women were still very valued producers. But they are going to lose a lot of their economic power, with one exception, which I will get to. All right, so women then have less economic power in most patry-oriented horticultural groups than in hunting and gathering, with one exception. And this is not on the current slide, showing you how old of a presentation this is. The exception is where women do market trade. And you all know about women doing market trade because in Southeast Asia, this has long been a women's tradition. Women have not only traded in local markets, they have traded across borders into what are now different countries of Southeast Asia. Okay? And this has also been the case in West Africa, in the Andes, in other parts of the world, and wherever women in horticulture saw the kinship system switching to the male side, but those women were able to become traders, they maintained a great deal of economic power. This is the big exception. So this is a very old version of my presentation. All right, so then women had, just as in hunting and gathering, there was no created biology. You do not see the men strong and robust and the women skinny and undernourished. And this remains the case certainly in Southeast Asia today. And they also today still have an equal sex ratio at birth, even in groups that are patrilineal and patrilocal. And the reason I'm saying this is that in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the world's horticultural societies still are found, because most of them have very thin soil, and as you'll see in a moment, they cannot go on to plow agriculture. But they still have mostly female production systems. Do you know that at this very moment in sub-Saharan Africa, about 70% of the food crops are being raised not by men, but by women with home horticulture, okay? And so they have an equal sex ratio at birth, and they do not differentially feed girls less than boys. There's no malnutrition by sex. All right, I'm going to go down. And the invention of the plow, which occurred in the Middle East between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, changed everything. It changed history, and it changed equality for both men and women, and it led to substantial inequality for women almost everywhere that the plow entered, except for Southeast Asia. That was the big exception. The plow diffused along a western-eastern axis. From the Middle East, it took about 3,000 years to reach the Pacific Ocean, Siberia, and China. Okay? And the thing about the Eurasian landmass is it has marvelously deep, fertile soil. So the original plow that was invented was a huge contraption, and it went, let's say you would need soil about as high from the floor as my hand is now. For this big wooden contraption to go deep into the soil, break up the weeds at the bottom, bring up the nutrients from far below. And the Eurasian landmass had one other incredible advantage, which is written about, well, it was noticed by Engels, and it was written about again by Jared Diamond in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, and that was the Eurasian landmass has 24 of the 25 most valuable domesticatable animals. And that means they got all the valuable ones that will carry goods on their backs, or will pull a cart, or pull a chariot, or a wagon. Oxen and cattle and horses and camels and donkeys, and then they would interbreed the horses and the donkeys and get mules. And all of these then led to a greater surplus. And it also permitted, for the first time in human history, without even irrigation, you could have permanent cultivation, which meant that people could settle down. There could be individual ownership of land. People could be trapped by an emerging state with a standing army that would keep them enslaved, as it were, serfs, to the owners of the means of production, the owners of the land, the aristocracy, the rulers, the kings, in the case of China, after the plow reached them, the emperor, okay? And these became state-level societies. And most of them went completely to a male-dominated kinship and property system, except in Western Europe. They stayed the original hunting and gathering system of bilateral kinship, mother's side and father's side relatives being counted equally. But in the Middle East, in North Africa, from which I mean the two countries practically touch, Morocco and Spain, okay? So the Middle East and North Africa, Europe, and getting over into Asia, in South Asia and in East Asia, where the kinship system went all the way to the patri side, and women lost inheritance rights. The bridal couple would move to live with the husbands, the groom's male kin, and the woman left her group usually forever. So this then started major gender inequality because of a very important difference between two types of agrarian cultivation, whether it is grain-fed, meaning no irrigation, or whether it is irrigated, which in today's world means only irrigated rice. That is the key crop where you have wet rice, or irrigated cultivation with the plow. And this then was the southernmost part of Asia, not just South Asia, but the southern part of China, the southern part of India, and then Bangladesh, the most southerly country in South Asia. They went to irrigated rice, which gave them very dense populations. And there's an incredible difference between the crops that were grown farther north, which were unirrigated, and rice. Rice is a miracle crop. It is the world's most labor elastic, meaning that as long as you add labor slowly, you can support a very large population. Let's say in the north, you've got dry plow agriculture, and it takes 2 men and a mule 2 days to plow a field. You cannot support 50 people from their production. They'll starve. But let's say you're in the south of China. You're anywhere in Thailand. You are anywhere pretty much in the lowlands of Southeast Asia. All right? And you're in most of East Asia, the parts that have irrigated rice. As long as you add the labor slowly, every new pair of hands that you add is going to grow more irrigated rice by working very, very hard than that person's mouth is going to eat. Meaning, some of the rice can be shipped out. Like, why do you think they built the Grand Canal in China? To get rice to the north. All right? Anyway, so this is what happened, and this is why China and India have respectively almost 1.4 billion and 1.3 billion, because in the south they have irrigated rice, and that's where they have the densest populations. Why do you think that Southeast Asia has, in a slightly outdated figure, over 620 million people, whereas the entire European Union before Brexit had 507 million people? Irrigated rice in the lowlands. The upland tribes and indigenous peoples still use horticulture, and females are important in cultivation in horticulture. But in grain-fed agrarian, these non-elastic crops, there's not even enough work for the men. And so men push other men out of production, creating an underclass. And you better believe they push out almost all of the women. The only jobs for women in a dry agrarian system are usually for the lowest class or the lowest caste of women who do little extra things during harvest and planting, etc., etc. The other women, the wives of the farmers, the wives of the elites, are now considered useless. They're considered economic parasites. And in most parts, wait a second, it gets worse. There is something called a patriarchal bargain. And let's see if I think it's on the next slide. Let me go down. Okay, here we go. Patriarchal bargain. Was it on the previous one? All right, I think it might have been. Let's see. I don't know how to go back, so we'll stay here. There was a little line there that said that two people, Caldwell and Denise Candioti from Turkey, have both hypothesized a patriarchal belt that is almost identical, starting in the Middle East, North Africa, extending over most of South Asia, extending over the northern parts of East Asia, where they do not grow irrigated rice. And that's pretty much it. And in those regions, they have the full patriarchal kinship and property system, and women were pushed out of production and into the house. Denise Candioti calls this the patriarchal bargain. The women agreed to be secluded behind four walls, 24/7, as we would say, as long as the man promised to support her and her children. She was willing to be subordinate and kept in the house. Well, once you're in the house, you are out of history. And so this is where we got the most extreme cases of subjugation of women. And among the elites, it reached some of the cruelest ways. Foot binding in China, from the 900s to the 1900s, only in the north as a widespread custom. Why? Because in the north, the women of the farming classes and above were in the house. Only the poorest of the poor women did some work in the fields. And didn't count. If their feet were unbound, who cared? But the higher the social class, the more they distorted the foot, the tighter the bindings, the more likely it was to create a lifelong low-grade infection, which stunk, so the women wore perfume and wore little white socks over their deformed feet. All right, in India, the higher castes had a joint family system where after the death of the father, the sons were to farm together for a few years before dividing the land, in order to protect themselves from the fact that their mother was a considerably younger person than their father and might easily remarry and give birth to a competing heir. They instituted the custom of sati, which is widow burning. And they forced their dear mother on the funeral pyre and threw her back on if she managed to escape. None of this happened, of course, in the lower castes because they didn't have the resources. Now, in the south, in China, wherever there was irrigated rice, and women of the farming classes had to work because it is so labor intensive that men and women and girls and boys and all available domesticated animals must work in the rice paddy, okay? Now, a woman could not go into a rice paddy with bound feet because the infection would kill her because they cleverly added fish to the rice paddy, not only for protein, but because the feces of the fish fertilized the rice paddy. So there was some mild foot binding for women who were weavers and never ever were in a rice paddy in their lives, but it never really caught on in the South, and it was never practiced by those whose women had to work in the rice paddies because they were able to support an entire family and sell or export rice on much less than 1 hectare, 2.47 acres, okay? Now, I did a lot of work in agriculture from the mid to late 80s through almost the late 90s because there was a lot of money going into agriculture, USAID, the World Bank, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, FAO, and I worked for all those agencies. So I worked most of the world's major cropping systems, and I'm still amazed by how rice is so different, irrigated rice. Anyway, so now we can talk about the peasants, as I said. Foot binding also extended to all but the poorest peasants in the north, but it was just a little bit of foot binding because those women were working hard as housewives, okay? In the south, as I said, never for women who worked in the, oh, and here it is. Here's the patriarchal bargain again. Boy, oh boy, this is a different presentation than my last version. Kandiyoti, yeah, the women accepted seclusion. Now, we also have the first example of a negative created biology of gender stratification for both men and women, but it was worse for women. Why do I say men as well? Because you're starting to see a difference in height, in longevity, and in the robustness of bones between the peasants and the ruling class, okay? And when you compare the skeletons of peasants of both sexes, these are not genders, these are biological sexes. When you're comparing hunters and gatherers and peasants of the agrarian era, you will find that the hunters and gatherers, both male and female, have very strong, robust bones, and that the peasants have sickly, scrawny, weaker bones, miserable diets, okay? And worse among females because by this time there was systematic malnutrition. Now, if we look at peasant women in agrarian societies, the women worked, they worked long, long hours, but their labor was hidden because they didn't work in the fields. They were seen as parasites. And this is going to be important. All right, so the consequences of the created biology, which now have emerged, are the worst in non-irrigated agrarian societies. And with women were seen as economic parasites then or now, you don't bother to feed them as well. And there is a very important scientific fact. If anyone is deprived of protein before the age of 2, what this does is it cuts off the right tail of the IQ distribution, the really smart ones. And then the normal curve of IQ, which is a normal curve, skews this way. And what it means is you've lost almost all of the smartest females who were systematically deprived of protein on the grounds that they would grow up to be utterly useless economic parasites. And this was in the rain-fed agrarian. So here we have full-fledged created biology of gender stratification. And it made the women less intelligent. And not only that, the people who study environment, the people who study ecology, write of something called an impoverished niche. And of those women who were in seclusion in the rural areas, the patriarchal bargain, then and now, especially if they are poor and there's no television, there's no radio, at least not for them, no mobile phone, then it constitutes an impoverished niche. The women end up with a very narrow view of what is in the world and have very little to talk about that the men have any interest in listening to. There are endless stories about women and children and illness and, oh God, this sort of thing. The men say, forget it. Okay? And so what you have here is they do not converse with the women on any subject of importance, and the women lose even more. Okay? Now, today, these women would be the last ones to be added to the school systems. Fortunately, through a big push from UNESCO and the Education for All initiative, okay, which I've been working for a number of years with UNESCO. Anyway, due to that, we have pretty well eliminated. I mean, we've gotten like 97% of children into elementary, into primary school, and there are only a few places where there's a remaining gender bias against girls, and that is in the poorest parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa, where the poor mother cannot afford to let the oldest daughter go to school, and sometimes even the next daughter, because they need them to bring, first of all, help with the farming. Secondly, to bring firewood, which is getting scarcer and scarcer with deforestation. And third, to bring water, which is getting harder and harder to find and longer to bring from, because, again, deforestation cuts the rainfall in half if it's complete deforestation, and it also lowers the water table, making traditional wells useless if they cannot be rebored to a deeper depth, okay? So, this is where you get one group of girls out of school, the other group are in the most patriarchal countries of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Places like Afghanistan, which I worked in and will tell you about shortly. Okay, so anyhow, so they get very little education. And ignorant mothers raise less healthy, less educated, not only girls, but also boys. Their boys are less healthy. Their boys are less educated. And they have a greater likelihood of malnutrition, obviously, especially girls. But these women just don't know enough. And they are so subjugated that the men will not basically let them out of the house, and they certainly don't want them earning their own income. So let me go on. I did a case study for the World Bank, and if I have the time, I'd like to tell you briefly what it was in. We looked at malnutrition in South Asia, and the links we found to female economic dependency and low female labor force participation. And in the current version, there is a definition of labor force participation, which is LFP. Now, we published two things, 2013A and 2013B, looking at what is called the South Asian Enigma. And what is the South Asian Enigma? Okay, the South Asian Enigma is that South Asia is not the world's poorest region, but it has the world's worst malnutrition for children 5 and under. 42% of them are underweight to the point of being classified as malnourished. Now, what is the world's poorest region? It happens to be Central and West Africa, which remains largely horticultural but is desperately poor. There, the rate of childhood malnutrition measured this way is only 23%. Slightly, it's just a teensy bit more than 1/2. And this is the world's poorest region. But they do not have the female economic dependency, the female subjugation, the female economic dependency of South Asia, okay? So, there was a clue that we found when we did our literature review. Smith et al. Thought that there was something in low female status that was a factor in the South Asian enigma. So we went into it and we found that it was indeed females' economic dependency. And this we found was linked to their low female labor force participation, and it was key because these women were still considered parasites. They were kept in the house. They didn't have permission to have freedom of movement. They did not go out to earn any sort of an income, and if they did any sort of productive work in the house, they never saw a cent of the proceeds because it would go to the senior males. And these nutrition programs that attempted to educate these young mothers, which I'll get to in a moment, all the things that go wrong for them. But they tried to educate the young mothers, and they tried to get them to feed their children more nutritious food, which would have required an additional expenditure. And they never once went to the people with power. They never once went to the senior males in the household. They didn't even talk to the mother-in-law, who had at least power over the daughters-in-law, okay? And so they were wasting their time and their money. Nutrition did not improve. Now, let me tell you a little bit more. They also have teen girls are considered an economic burden to their family. So they marry them young, as soon as possible after they start to menstruate, and because they're scrawny and undernourished, they will not start menstruating till at least age 15. And then they marry them, and in South Asia has the world's highest percentage of married teen mothers, and this is not good. Let me explain. Women who go to live with their in-laws, and that is the marital pattern, patrilocal residence, with this male kinship property system. They expect the woman to give them a baby within 12 months if she is not earning income, and overwhelmingly these girls do not earn income. And the sad thing is that the World Health Organization says that the minimum weight gain in pregnancy should be 10 kilos, 22 pounds. These girls deliver with an average weight gain of 5 kilos, 11 pounds. And what's worse is that this is corresponding or linked to a maternal mortality rate that is 200% to 500% higher than for girls who deliver their first child over age 18. And that's not all. They are the world's most likely to give birth to LBWs, low birth weight babies. And low birth weight babies, which I think are up to a half of all births in some of these poor regions of South Asia with dependent females, result in lifelong cognitive and health problems. And let me just give you one example that was in the news slides. This originally came from Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winning economist, who looked at the rates of early onset heart disease in India in the 40s and traced it back to low birth weight babies, which actually extend to many social classes and castes in India, okay? And so this was enough to have an epidemic of early onset heart disease in India because these scrawny little girls gave birth, malnourished little girls gave birth to such tiny little low birth weight babies. And also, since the women had no income, no freedom of movement, and they didn't approach the men to persuade them, or even the mother-in-law, all those nutrition, education, and aid programs fell. There is one that we found that really did the trick. It was in Bangladesh. It was it's the Economic Livelihood for Adolescents, and they first trained them in income-generating activities. Then they gave them microcredit and told them, look, if your parents want a little piece of your loan because they have something they need the money for, we're not going to say anything, okay? Suddenly the parents consider them as assets. They no longer married them off as young. And when they were married, the parents would say to the new in-laws, you're getting a treasure. She knows how to earn income. You shouldn't treat her badly. And those women were not under pressure to give birth to a child within 12 months. So this was what we found. All right, so this is the third one. What is the least gender equal nation today with the worst created biology? I vote for Afghanistan, okay? I worked there in 2011. Their traditional base is non-irrigated agriculture with varying degrees of herding depending on how dry or mountainous it is. Now, I was there not to study gender. I was there to do final evaluations of two very important UNDP projects. One was the Afghanistan National Development Strategy, and the other was the Afghanistan National Development Program, through both of which 80% of the billions of dollars in aid flowing into Afghanistan every year was supposed to have been aligned. Unfortunately, the programs were way behind schedule and it didn't happen that way, but one of them made history The first one, the Afghanistan National Development Strategy, was the first one in the country's history to talk to people in all 34 provinces, and even more revolutionary was the fact they had talked to women as well as men. All right, that's the only thing I'll tell you from the finding, because everything else looks lousy. I looked at gender on my own initiative. I often do this. I did a hydropower project in Malawi last August, September, and I looked at the gender angles, although you would think that there would not be any in a hydropower project. I found some. But anyway, so I looked at them here. And I found UN data, and they warned me, do not believe the data of the Allied forces, do not believe the data of USAID. They are doing it for Congress, okay? They say stick with UN data, and so I have. It was a little older. They found that women had either have use rights or were able to control something like 1.87% of the land. Now, this is in a country that was at that time 77% rural, and is still roughly 3/4 rural today. Okay, and they also found that women run roughly 6% of businesses in Afghanistan, and that over age 26, 88% of women were illiterate. Of MDs, of medical doctors, females were 22%. Nurses were only 17% female. Unfortunately, they had a very strong kind of taboo that only a female could treat another female. So this led to incredibly high infant and maternal mortality. Also, if you look at the statistics, my God, there's no violence against women in Afghanistan. It would shame a family horribly to report domestic violence. And so believe me, it is almost never reported unless somebody is murdered in the full sight of the whole village, I guess. And yet the UN studies found that roughly 80% of women were victims of domestic violence, of violence against women. All right. Now, I went to the Ministry of Women's Affairs with a program officer who also was a woman, as it happened. She was from one of the northern ethnic groups, not Pashtun, which is the most patriarchal, and they consider women to be property. And the number 3 person in this ministry told us, quote, most men, this was in English, don't consider women to be quite human beings. And I'm not kidding. In Pashtun ideology, women and domestic animals are property to be used as the male chooses. All right? And they're the dominant ethnic group. Now, there's one thing I want to show you. It's the next slide, and I won't be able to go back, so let me just tell you what I'm going to show you. All right? It says that I said that most women were afraid to be on the streets without a burqa that was 100% anonymous. Now, I want you to look around at all the women from the Gulf states who are here in Bangkok. And they may be wearing a black abaya, but I'd say that 90+% of them have decorated that abaya to show their individuality. It has embroidered flowers, it has sequins, it has beads, it has all kinds of, costume jewelry, or maybe even some semi-precious stones. And so no two are usually alike, and you see so few that are not decorated, okay? Heaven forbid that a woman in Afghanistan will wear a burqa that someone can recognize. They wouldn't do it because it could get them killed. Look at the next slide. All right, here are 2 pictures. The first one was taken outdoors. And there's some sort of a rally, which is 100% male. And they're holding up pictures of some male politician. And this one does not look very violent, okay? Now, this is at a clinic for mothers and children, maternal and child health. And you'll notice that almost every woman is wearing an identical colored, sort of medium blue burqa, okay? Now, the part that covers her eyes is deliberately, they use very thick twine so that you cannot see anything of the eyes or the face behind those little thingies that go they either put them on the diagonal or else they just go, at 90-degree angles, okay?
It's like a mesh. Yeah.
It's a mesh. It's a very heavy mesh. Unfortunately, they also have no peripheral vision, and everything you see through that, because they use this heavy twine, has little thingies coming off of them, and it's very blurry. At dawn or at dusk, a driver cannot see this shade of blue. It's invisible. And a lot of women are killed in road accidents because they couldn't see the car, and the driver could not see that shade of blue. All right? So this is what you find. And I was once, I will tell you the story if you have questions, but it's not for the tape. I was once stuck with insufficient hijab in the main square of Kabul by a new UNDP driver who either really did not know the city or was trying to get me killed. I'm not quite sure which, but I will be charitable and say that he did not know the city. He took me in by the wrong entrance to the green zone, and I was out there with the only woman. There was one woman in a burqa begging about a full city block away where there was a traffic light and cars were stopped. And there was only me, and boy, oh boy. By the time I managed to get through this very, very long sidewalk, I'll tell you the rest of the story afterwards if you want, to get into the green zone, I had this really strong feeling that somebody was aiming something at the small of my back. And I will tell you the story afterwards, not on the video. And the answer was probably yes, as they found out a little bit later on September 13th. 2011, but that's another story. All right, moving on. All right, so the main gender equality facts and trends in today's world, and I'm really sorry that I don't have the newer version because it was so much more about bioethics. I will add it at the end. So the main gender equality facts and trends in today's world is that look at human history. If 96+% of human history by the old date of 200,000 years for Homo sapiens is, that cultivation emerged only 10 to 12,000 years ago, that for most of our history, we lived in a way, and I'm sorry that Daryl's not here because I wanted him to comment on the evidence for organized combat, and there's almost none. When it comes to violence, the archaeological evidence does not find burial with weapons, does not find burial by certain males of booty or additional females in hunting and gathering graves, and does not find fortifications around their camping grounds, or not villages, but a few of them did live in caves for part of the year, and there were no fortifications, and they generally were living within very easy access to water. You start to get villages relocated for defensive purposes. Once you start to get fighting, you start to get defensive fortifications, you start to get burial with weapons. Archaeologically, you can really tell when there is considerable violence, okay? There is very little question about this. So anyhow, there's only a tiny percentage, maybe 3% of human history, where women have not been important in a major production system, and this is only in dry agrarian cultivation. And incidentally, in Europe, it was never quite as patriarchal as in South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, or the dry parts of East Asia for one very simple reason. They did not ever abandon the old hunting and gathering bilateral kinship system. Maybe it tilted a bit more toward the males, but they still recognized female relatives. Females could still inherit, and therefore they retained more in the way of autonomy and access to income. I read up about medieval market fairs, where people would go to get rosemary and rosemary, thyme, and whatever is in the song. But basically, the women themselves brought in stuff to be traded. they brought in the eggs, they brought in the weavings, they brought in things. They were not in seclusion, and they participated in markets. It was not as much as in West Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Andean region, but it was enough to mean that Europe never got quite as patriarchal as the parts of the whole Eurasian landmass that went completely to the male property and kinship system. But this is like 3% and one group on this planet. And it's, however, the group that won. And the histories were written by, the people with writing in mostly East and South Asia, the religious writings, all the other writings, and ultimately, when they caught up, the people in Europe. And this also corresponded to a somewhat more male-dominated period, but it was still nowhere near as much as in the rest of the whole patriarchal belt. So as I told you, the plow requires deep soils. Many tropical nations have thin soils and remain horticultural and female farming even today. In sub-Saharan Africa, where most of them are located, 75% of the horticultural societies went to the patry side. They went from matry to patry. And again, the system means that the women have less economic resources unless they are market traders, where they have greater equality. That is especially true in West Africa, but in recent years, it's also become true in Southern Africa and in East Africa. Now, among agrarian societies, only irrigated rice societies in Southeast Asia maintain the old hunting and gathering system of bilateral kinship, and some of them tilted toward the female side with matrilocal residence, which is very common in Isan and parts of Southeast Asia, and all among the Lao people and the Lao Mun across the Mekong River. And there are some who went completely matrilineal, such as the Minangkabau, who live in Sumatra and in one or two of the provinces of Malaysia, the world's largest matrilineal group, over 8 million. Among agrarians, okay, I mentioned that. So all the other agrarian societies are patriarchal to varying degrees, and these were the winners. These are the ones who wrote the history books. And most histories don't go back any farther. The oldest that they'll usually go is Egypt, okay? Many of them start with Greece or Rome, or the rise of China, depending on where the book is being written. And so you are not getting the whole picture that there was no created biology of gender stratification until very recently, and then only in one small slice of humanity, but a very important slice. Okay, so let me move on, and then I'll finish very soon.
Probably the most important slice.
Yes, well, of course. Here's a picture of African women hoeing. Here's a picture of Southeast Asian women transplanting irrigated rice. Most of them are doing this in thigh-deep in muddy water, and no wonder they could not have bound feet, okay? All right, so then the next one, that's the Southeast Asia rice transplanting. I think this one's in Indonesia. And the economic impact of low versus high female labor force participation today. In the Middle East and much of South Asia, female labor force participation remains very low. And the average female labor force participation grew only 0.17, less than 0.2% a year for the last 30 years in MENA, which is Middle East, North Africa. So in other words, it took them approximately 6 years to add 1% of female labor force participation. Now, these days, economists have been doing studies of the impact of women's economic empowerment versus lack of economic empowerment. They have calculated, and I can give you the references, that Middle East, North Africa loses the most. They have the lowest average for women's labor force participation. They are losing 27% of GDP, more than a quarter. The next one is South Asia, which loses 23%. There are a couple of countries in there that do not follow the same model, okay? And these are World Bank data. In Southeast Asia, women's labor force participation is not only high, it's rising, and Southeast Asia is now the world's fastest growing region economically, and as I say, it is not tiny. It was several years ago at 620 million people when I wrote this particular set of slides. East Asia has been the fastest growing region in the past. You know, the industrialization miracle through export-oriented industrialization. It has very high female labor force participation now, although lower than Southeast Asia. And it has had a fertility crash. Unlike Southeast Asia, which is still maintaining something like 2.3 fertility, which is just a hair over replacement, which is quite healthy. East Asia is down to 1.3, and that is accepting China at 1.5 children per woman, even though a new study said that they have been fudging their data, and the actual figure is 1.1. That 35 years of the one-child policy have brought them down to a disastrously low figure. And Osama and I did our first research together on aging in Asia and finding that low fertility was linked to a shrinking labor force and therefore lower GDP, an aging population, and a shrinking population, and that the country with the worst problem was the least concerned, and that was Japan. But now it has spread. It's much worse in the rest of East Asia. And if the new figures on China are really valid, it's even worse. And the reason is that these women are working. And so now they have a voice in household decisions, which I will talk about. And they tell their husbands, you don't do a thing to help me, never lift a finger. All right, I've had one child and I think that's lovely. That's it, kiddo. You know, and so not having second children is resulting in a fertility crash in East Asia. And I attribute this because I did some work on it in Korea in 2008. And that was why women didn't want to have second children. The men didn't help them. All right, moving on. So this, as I say, also it leads to more unmarried men. They've had this problem in Korea, they have it in China. Why? Because in China, they also in Korea, they've had sex-selective abortion. So you end up with fewer female births, and these grow up to be fewer adult females that poor men can convince and persuade to marry them. All right? And so they're now going all over East Asia and other parts of the world for brides. Okay? And in China, they call them bare branches. And they fear that they may turn to violence. They're especially numerous in the Northeast, rain-fed agrarian, very poor region. Who wants to marry a man and live up there? Okay, and they have a high rate of female abortion up there, sex-selective abortion. All right, so let me move on. The global impact. I'm almost finished. The global impact of the surge in female labor force participation in rich nations, and these are findings from a study done in 2006 by The Economist. They were looking for the most important variables behind global GDP growth in the fairly positive growth period of 1985 through 2005, and their quantitative studies identified three principal factors. The first one was the rise of China and India as global powers. The second one was the rise of computers and the internet. And the third one was the rise in women's labor force participation in the world's rich nations, the advanced industrial countries. When they did further analysis, they discovered that it was the most consequential factor was the rise in women's employment in the rich countries of the world. And the headline that they ran, or the subhead that they ran, was "Forget China, India, and the Internet. Economic growth is driven by women." So, those regions of the world with low female labor force participation are at a great disadvantage, and there is something even worse. Low female labor force participation and armed conflict. This is something we have to worry about. Mary Caprioli did 2 studies and some more since then, studying the relationship between females' labor force participation and armed conflict, abbreviated AC, both across and within international boundaries. She found a roughly 5% drop in female labor force participation was correlated with, she's not claiming causality, an almost 500% drop, it was 486%, in the probability of armed conflict being present. In other words, okay, let me rephrase. 5% less female labor force participation was linked to an almost 500% greater likelihood of armed conflict. So what I did is I looked at the bottom 7 nations in female labor force participation in the world. Their average female labor force participation was 15.5%. The global average of close to 200 countries using World Bank data was 53% of their women were in the labor force. So if you take this, and the new figure I saw was 55, but I'm not insisting on that. It's nearly 4,000% more probable that a country with 15% female labor force participation will be fighting, engaged in armed conflict, than a country at 53 or 55% female labor force participation. Now here is the bottom line. All 7 of the countries with the lowest female labor force participation in the world are indeed currently engaged in armed conflict. In alphabetical order, they are Afghanistan, Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and that all of them are currently fighting. Now you can use one other statistic, which is the gender gap between male and female labor force participation, and there is one change in the countries. Jordan drops out and you substitute Pakistan. But all 7 of those countries are currently engaged in armed conflict.
And the reason is?
It's not, this is only a correlation. I am not claiming causality, but I think it really hurts not to have any female voices at the table of power. And with women not in the labor force, they have no voice. They have no voice in the household, they have no voice beyond the household. And it's not enough to have education, because Saudi Arabia has a huge predominance of females in the universities, and women do not drive, and only 10-15% of college graduates can find a job, any job. They don't want them to work, all right? So, the created biology of gender stratification. Let me very quickly tell you about the most equal cases. The groups that are closest to gender equality, I found 7, and I'm going to also tell you very quickly about the Iroquois. I've told you about Afghanistan, where the men control almost 100% of economic power. Let me tell you about the very much studied Iroquois tribes, a confederation of 6 tribes in colonial North America, who are still living in their tribal, in their ancestral lands in upstate New York and southern Ontario. They never were forced onto a march of tears. They're still there. There, the women controlled the entire economy, nearly 100%. The system was matrilineal, matrilocal, and the women, it was horticultural. And the women were the primary farmers, and they lived in long houses, maybe 3 or 4 nuclear households, bilateral kinship. And there would be a matron, it was matrilineal kinship. A woman would be the head of each loghouse. She was called a matron. The women had a council of matrons. The men had a council of elders. The women dominated the entire economy. The men dominated the political sphere. But the chief was nominated by the council of matrons. And if the council of matrons did not like his performance, they got rid of him. They impeached him, so to speak, and nominated a new man to be the chief. On top of that, they were equal in religion, both men and women, and the women had veto power, although they used it very rarely, over male military expeditions. Because when the men went on the warpath, as it was called, they needed to get this very lightweight trail food that they could eat for a couple of weeks at a time. And the women made something that was called pemmican, with a mixture of fat and meat and nuts and fruits, sort of like our trail mix. And they would not unlock the storehouses for the men if they opposed that particular expedition. It didn't happen often, apparently, but it happened. So they had veto power over another form of male power, which was the power of force. Now, they were called a matriarchy by the first people who studied them, who had never seen this level of equality. But looking at my theory and all that, I will tell you that I would consider them to have been gender equal. This was not a matriarchy. And so this, moving on with this, in the places where I found the greatest equality, in the four I studied, of the 7 that I encountered, women had at least 50% of economic resources. In the village of Chanchalón, in the Ecuadorian Andes, it was 50%, and that was with NSF funding, where they did a survey. At the same time, I was working there on dairying projects, and it was 50.3% for the men on economic resources, 49.7% for the women, and there was no statistical difference whatsoever. In Isan, in northeast Thailand, and I've also worked 3 times in Laos, mostly among the ethnic Lao Lu. And there it was somewhat slightly more than 50%, and I can go into it if anyone wants to hear the data. I also found that in the Vijagos Islands off the coast of Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, the women controlled far more than 50%. And among the people in Yunnan province in southwestern China who called themselves Mazat, the government calls them Moswo, they also have way more. The women have way more than 50%. And couples married, but they live in their mother's house all their lives, and they have visiting marriages and complete sexual freedom. And they live in these larger families and with harmony. And they laugh at the Han Chinese for living in these patriarchal households where the mother-in-law and daughter-in-laws are always fighting, where the brothers don't get along all that well with the father, and they say their lives are miserable, and if they want to live alone, then it is impossible for 2 adults with small children to run a farm and make a living. And they say, we always live surrounded by our sisters and brothers, and we're happy. So this is what I found there. Anyway, moving on. What I found in these places that I visited personally, that if they had a motto, it would have probably been the old U.S. Army slogan called, "Be all that you can be." And what I found is that both men and women were maximizing who they were. And it was much less strict, for example, on gender, let's say, on homosexuality. They tended to be much more tolerant than neighboring groups. This is particularly the case in southern Mexico with a very much studied group, the Zapotecs, or Zapotecas in Spanish, in Juchitán, in Oaxaca province. And the gender equality, the women's economic power, goes along with great tolerance for variations in sexual identity. Anyway, the idea is be all that you can be, and it allows men to be what they can be without conforming to a really macho stereotype if they don't like to do that. It allows women to, live their talents, to live a life that expands on their possibilities, to be all they can be. Anyway, let me just finish. Why is it that women's economic power is so beneficial for the woman and for her family's wealth and well-being? As I mentioned to you, the key variable in my general theory of gender stratification, and I also have one of gender and development, is that women who control income have greater self-confidence. They have more vote in household decisions. This includes decisions on their children's well-being, on their own fertility, and on the family spending patterns. And these women promote the education of their children's nutrition, and their children's health. And they also have lower fertility, and they have less Wasteful spending. All right. Income controlling women. Also, this is a key hypothesis for my gender and development theory. They spend disproportionately less on their children's education, nutrition, and health, which are three of the key aspects of human capital. And there are now something like 60 studies, mostly done by male World Bank economists, that back me on these disproportionate spending habits of men versus women with provider responsibilities, that the women spend disproportionately on their children's welfare after taking care of whatever economic activity it was that got them the income. So finally, the women then also have less fertility, and as we're going to see, these things promote not only family but national well-being. Let me show you this slide. Why is women's economic power so beneficial for national wealth and well-being? At the country level, greater human capital, education, nutrition, health, results in both increased national income growth, GDP growth, and better indicators of welfare and well-being, okay? At the country level, higher fertility still is linked to less national income growth. And women who have more income don't have high fertility. But women who do not have control of income have no control over their bodies, have no control over their fertility. And you get high fertility mostly in those countries, and these were in recent studies by some of the world's most famous demographers, Bongards et al. And Dasgupta et al., published in 2011. So women's gender, greater women's economic power and greater women's equality helps both women and men and results in a positive created biology that's linked to less gender stratification and more self-realization for both men and women. And it especially benefits women. And so the last group is the low education white males. Is this a new gender link created biology, or will we have to ultimately include both male and females? And Trump, during his campaign, blamed the loss of male blue-collar jobs on immigration and offshoring. But it's mostly automation and robots that cut through male labor force participation. And so if the percentage of manufacturing GDP has not dropped in the United States, what has dropped are manufacturing jobs. They fell from 17 million in 1990s to 11.5 million in 2010, and it's now a total of 12.3 million. These men now suffer from the impact of what I call created biology and are called diseases of despair. Higher suicide rates, higher alcoholism and liver diseases and death from cirrhosis of the liver, higher depression, higher opioid addiction because they were given a prescription for a work injury in their blue-collar work and they became addicted. And there has now been a 400% rise in overdose deaths in the United States from opioids. There were 183,000 between 1999 and 2015, and there were greater than 30,000 in 2015 alone. Also, these working-class white men with no more than a high school education are much more likely to smoke and die of lung cancer. They are much more likely to be obese. And low-education women have many of these same issues, but not as strongly. But even so, they're getting them for the first time. And there's a brand new study, 2017, by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, and they found rising death rates for white men and women ages 25 through 64 in the period 1999 through 2015, but no other group in the United States, including African Americans, including Latinos, had a rising death rate. This was the first decrease in the United States life expectancy since 1993, and it is limited to low education working class whites. And a key factor in the increased death rates of men between 50 and 54.
Wow.
Okay, and they are dying. Also, the female rate has risen much faster than men. And these are more statistics that just show how much more deaths there are. And there are now fewer deaths in the big cities and their suburbs, and more are in smaller or rural and more white places. And the urban-rural divide is widening in everything, in their diseases, in their death rates. And also, these high school educated whites are the most pessimistic about their economic prospects. Many see theirs as being in continuous decline and worse than their parents. They have given up. And according to Case and Deaton, they have experienced a cumulative disadvantage over time. Their health and personal problems often lead them to drug overdoses, alcohol-linked liver disease, and suicide. And I will argue that you will soon find skeletal evidence of the diseases of despair, just like you found between hunters and gatherers and horticultural people versus agrarian societies that were male-dominated. I think you will soon be finding that these men are shorter than their fathers and their grandfathers. We know that in the agrarian era, there was a 7-year gap in longevity between the better off and the peasants. We know there was a 5-inch difference in height between the upper classes and the peasants. So it is not out of the possibility to say that looking at created biology of gender stratification, we will soon see skeletal evidence of this in these low-educated whites. All right, so the final slide, and I told the presentation had far fewer slides on the first part and more on the last. The final slide looks at this as an emerging theory. And I'm arguing that in terms of bioethics, I think we have to add the created biology of inequality as one variable, and I think you're looking at this already, but I think we also have to add the created biology of gender inequality, and with, once again, women's relative economic power as the most consequential factor in not only women's overarching power and relative position with respect to men, but also with respect to the consequences, good versus bad, for the women, their families, their society, and for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray.
Okay, and the other one was a shorter presentation, unfortunately. This one went way long.
Okay, we'll still have time for tutor tip before lunch.
Yeah.
Tutor tip, go ahead, questions.
I wish you had given me some sort of warning at the time.
Well, you can go. My presentation will be pretty short.
Oh, no, by all means, take your time. Let me sit down.
Do you have any questions?
Oh, yeah. Any questions?
Thank you very much for the
comments.
Yes.
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for your presentation. It has been very meaningful and engaging. And I realize I agree with you that how important it is to realize, for women to have economic independence. And as an educator, I'm a teacher educator here at university in Tokyo, in Japan. I'm very careful when I teach my students, particularly female students, how to be economically independent. And at the same time, I'm very careful, to look at different options for them to be economically independent. Sometimes when you present information, the examples, then they tend to feel that they have to choose one over other. For example, there are many international students from Vietnam at my university, and the other day, I had a meeting with a group of Vietnamese female students in my office, and it wasn't until then I realized that many of them were actually married. Most of them are under 25 years old, and they disclosed to me that it was normal. It's a cultural norm in Vietnam that women have to be married with kids by the age of 25 years old. Now, it may vary. I mean, it may not necessarily represent reality of, Vietnamese culture and marriage age in Vietnam. But at least, these students are very concerned, and they felt that they may fail because they have to take care of their kids, and they cannot attend classes. And being in Japan, many of these girls are here. I realized that how many of them are really here for economic independence. Therefore, they come here, enroll in colleges, and try to pursue their careers. But there is a wall that they have to overcome. And for them to see a woman like myself, for example, I'm 44 years old. I'm not married. I don't have any children. And they see me as an extreme case and of becoming economic independent. So they look at me and think, I don't know if I want to be like you. I want my family, I want my children, but I still want to be economically independent. Then I try to explain to them that, becoming economically independent doesn't mean that you cannot marry or, not having a husband or boyfriend or, children. You can also achieve those, but it takes much effort, like a dialogue, with your husband or boyfriend to educate them. And I think many times in this education, it's women who have to be educated to make their male partners understand how important it is for them to realize, what it means for women to be economically independent. It takes a lot of their understanding, right? But if I denigrate, them and say things like, Vietnamese society is very backwards. You have to break off from these old customs and, pursue your career, forget about men, and that's what they're very fearful of. I don't know because of that, because, Japanese society has been sort of following the step of the, US or other Western states, but they often talk about this fertility rate crisis. And there has been a lot of discussion in society that, this is bad. Therefore, there is the counterpart dialogue emerges and say, well, look what happened. This is a consequence of women becoming economically independent and too free, right? But I say that we challenge this discourse because the assumption of happy family or stable family or well-being of the society it lies in this assumption that women must be housewives, stay home, keep the family, and raise children. Therefore, you maintain, this healthy family model. But it isn't true. We all know that. But I don't know if it's that the society through the media conveys these messages too much to the public. Actually, many of my Japanese female students this time not the Vietnamese female students, but my Japanese female students, I've spoken to quite a few girls who said that they don't want to marry. They don't want to have any children. And I asked them why, and they feel like they have to choose one way or another. So they look at me as an example of, becoming economically independent is like me. They have to live their lives like me, or become domesticated housewife, right? So it takes a lot of understanding for them and what it really means to be economically independent, because for them it means that they many times interpret it as they having to abandon their traditional cultural values. Therefore, as a woman, they're stigmatized in society. So I try to be very careful, yet continue and persuade my students very patiently. And another comment that I'd like to provide you with this idea, disparity of disease. I think that's how you termed when you describe the situation of white male students dropping out of schools and or committing suicides or in prisons. I actually saw this when I was teaching at the Liberal Arts College. It was a predominantly white college in Illinois. Actually, at the college, there are actually many Latino and African American students enrolled. Many of them are brought from Chicago area. But they're also discussing the high dropout rate of the white male students. This is the rural community, like you talked about in your study, and it's always white male students in rural community, they drop out. Their dropout rate is higher. So I was talking to my white male student who was going to drop out, and I asked him why. Well, there's too much focus on multiculturalism in education courses. And I feel I'm neglected. I feel like I don't belong here. I feel like teachers worry too much about African American students and Latino students. And I tried to explain to him that was not the case. But then, there are a few other white male students like that, and then they all told me that, after they drop out, they will go back to their community and join the union, or someone became their gambler, or someone signed up for the military station overseas by now. It is true that there was much, in my education courses, I centered the discussion of multiculturalism and diversity issues in education. And some of the students didn't like that. But I think that you mentioned that dropout rates of African American students and Latino students are also high. But it is high for these white male students, the particular kind of white male students in rural community. And the reason they drop out is different from those minority students. And I think that for white male students, there's a lot that they have to understand. First, they have to realize their white male privilege and what impact it has on the society, and how they make meaning of it, and understand the society better. But it's very difficult for them to understand it because they feel like they are attacked. But I was very conscious of making them realize the impact of it, and then different issues for minority students and white students. And but at the same time, I think it is important for them to feel cared. Those white male students, because without their understanding of white male privilege, I think it's impossible for us to build, healthy, equal society.
You started out, during hunter and gatherer periods, the most important contribution of women to economic power was to produce children. Then you said tribes needed more. Let me give you the demographic evidence that was collected from hunters and gatherers in the middle of the 20th century, while they were still more or less living their same kind of life as before, okay? The evidence comes from the Kun in southern Africa, living in Botswana and Namibia, and it comes from Australian Aboriginals and a few other people. The first thing is that the spacing interval between births was roughly 4 years, which is very similar to the great apes, like bonobos, chimpanzees. They also are every 4 years. How did these women do it? For one thing, there were both passive means and active means. Let me define the passive means. That included prolonged breastfeeding and low body fat ratios. The prolonged breastfeeding was that because they did not work very hard. The studies that have been done by economic anthropologists showed that their work week in one of the world's worst habitats, the Kalahari Desert in Namibia and Botswana, was roughly 20 hours a week, and they went out hunting or gathering from 1.5 to 3.5 times a week. The women had their children roughly 4 years apart for 2 reasons. Well, more than 2, but anyway. The first one was they had a low body fat ratio because the hunted meat is very low in fat, except maybe in a cold climate where at the end of the summer the animals store fat for the winter. And the only sources of fat in the diet were from nuts, which they ate, and other occasional vegetable fats, because the hunted meat had very little fat. So it was a low body fat ratio, and that decreases the probability of conception. And below a certain body fat ratio, a woman will not menstruate and therefore cannot conceive, because no egg is dropped to be fertilized. The second reason is the long nursing. And as I say, weaning, they usually wean their children about age 4. So this meant that you're correct, that they were probably mostly pregnant or lactating, but they were not baby-making machines. They lost children, they did not bring them to maturity, but all of these studies show that except in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, women were bringing in more calories from their gathering than men were bringing in from hunting in the average group, for the very simple reason that plants do not run away, and they are therefore much more reliable, okay? And the men's meat was highly valued, and so it kind of worked out with men and women having roughly equal economic power. There are only 2 kinds of hunting and gathering groups in which they have found some gender inequality. One have been the Eskimos and other people who live north of the Arctic Circle, where there is very short season for gathering because the climate is so cold, and most of the calories comes from the men from hunting or from sea mammals that they catch, like whales and things like that. The other group are Australian Aboriginals, and that's a very long, complicated story because they have been in Australia for 40 to 60,000 years, and they were unable to switch to horticulture because it requires plants that are genetically plastic, that can be modified by humans, and unfortunately there was not a single cultigen like that in Australia. They remain hunters and gatherers. Wait, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
You see, we had this situation in India that in order to just do cooking, they would need some branches of trees, and so they needed more children. children would be sent to collect branches of trees.
All right, I am aware of that.
For cooking. And
Okay.
this was, as they say, one of the reasons deforestation happened.
Okay, that's possible. Okay.
So
All right.
what I'm saying is that
All right,
this gathering of food could
No,
be
no, no,
for
no.
children.
No, they did not, okay.
Not men, not adult men, not adult women, but sending children to collect, to gather food.
All right, there are data. Okay, let me speak to that. There are lots and lots of data on hunters and gatherers, and they do not use their children for economic purposes. Before about age 15, they have long, happy childhoods because with a 20-hour work week, they don't need the children's labor, and plus they are nomadic for at least part of the year, and that means they have to go and move around, and they can collect the branches that they will use for their campfire in the course of their wanderings on a given day. So child labor is not required until the middle of the horticultural period. With home horticulture, when women start having some more children and they start to intensify cultivation, where children are really used and exploited for economic purposes, starts with plow agriculture, and then they are used for taking care of younger siblings, for bringing in the wood for the fires, for bringing the water from the wells, and then children then have a short childhood, usually by age 7. In an agrarian society, the children are being used economically. They are not used for those purposes among hunters and gatherers, which was a minimum of 96+% of Homo sapien existence. And there are so many studies from anthropologists that what you're saying has, you're talking about people in India sending out their children to collect branches, let's say, and the girls, boys, whatever. But that is so much later in human history that there is no comparison. Women were not baby-making machines in 96+% of our history as far as all the demographers have ascertained. Their children were not exploited for economic purposes. You are talking about only the last few thousand years when there was considerable inequality and children were put to work. But if you look at the actual, both archaeology and anthropology of humans, it is only these last few thousand years, and I was trying to make that clear, and mostly in plow agricultural societies that do not irrigate, where children tend to be used for these kinds of tasks. Now, in the rice paddies, yes, they put children to work also quite early. But when you're talking about for hunting and gathering, for one thing, they did not have tribes. They lived in small groups called bands of about 25, 30 people, almost never more than 40. And the children were very few because in a band of 30 people, and if a woman is having a child every 4 years, and some of the children die, they have very, very few children at any one time. The children are precious to them because they are their social security system, and everyone can see the children and see that these children will help them in old age. And so, if you can read anthropology, I will be happy to give you all kinds of references. But what you're telling me is not according to the period I just discussed, okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Wow, incredible.
And then you were talking about, go ahead, Asama.
Let me regather my thoughts, and maybe somebody else can.
And you were talking about gender in India before?
Yeah. It's completely wiped out. What were we talking about? I mean, the last sentence before.
We were talking about, I told you
Use the mic.
About the girls, before boys were more educated.
And now they're
and now the
educating
girls have also been educated. And many of them, I don't recall now, it's either BBC or CNN, interviewed parents whose daughters, I think it was in the city of Bombay, who had got very good IT jobs.
Yeah.
They had their own flat, their own car, and they were refusing to get married. And the parents were pulling their hair out.
Wow.
Okay. All right. Well, for one thing, even with that small number of highly educated women, as I pointed out, the statistics in India are showing that female labor force participation is going down, not up, which is very bad for the economy in the future. That in northern India there always has been much more discrimination against females than in southern India, because in northern India, with the exception of Punjab, which has long used irrigation, it's dry. It is non-irrigated cultivation. Women were never in the fields unless they were from the Dalit caste, in which case they were doing small little things. So the women of like what do they call many of the farming castes? I'm forgetting the name, right? It starts with a J. But anyway, so the women of that, what?
Vaishyas.
Okay, but anyway, from the farming caste. So the women in the north did not go to the fields because with non-irrigated agriculture, the kinds of crops that you raise do not require a lot of labor. There's not even enough work for the men, and so the women were pushed aside. In southern India, where they do grow rice, irrigated rice, then you can intensify production, and then you will need everyone, men and women and domestic animals and boys and girls. But the main thing is that the Industrial Revolution in India took place in the south, in Bangalore and around there. And this is where you got you got the first export-oriented factories, where you got the IT industry. And the proportion of females in the labor force is much higher because this is the wet rice part of India. And even so, it's still not very equal because you have this extremely male-dominated kinship and property system, right? And so what you have in China and in India right now is still a lot of sex-selective abortion. And this is what I was telling you when I took the other one. They have done studies, and I have spoken to the authors, the researchers who did this study. They found when a woman has high education but is not employed, or certainly is not getting a good salary, then if her husband does not want her to have a daughter because of the dowry, he will urge her to have an abortion, and she will agree. But where the woman is earning a good income, and she gets pregnant and it's a girl, and if the husband suggests she abort the fetus, she will rarely agree with him. And so the only time you find a drop in sex-selective abortion in India is where the women have economic power and refuse to go along with this. Otherwise, you've got a really distorted sex ratio with roughly 14%, and it's now going higher. The percentage of girls to boys keeps dropping, just as the percentage of women to men in the labor force keeps dropping. These are very bad signs for India's economic future over the long run, okay? But meanwhile, since India still has a high fertility rate, one can be very, cynical and say, well, every dead female fetus means a little bit less fertility. But the sex-selective abortion is concentrated in the north, and when an educated woman agrees to that kind of an abortion, the chances are she does not have a well-paying job. Because the women, as I said, the studies have shown where the women have well-paying jobs and presumably are controlling at least part of their own income, they will not agree to this.
May I just add
Yeah.
something? The goddess of wealth is Saraswati, no, not Saraswati, Lakshmi, a woman. So the first girl born in the family is called Lakshmi.
Okay.
She brings wealth to them. The second one, they will sit down and cry because
Yes.
it means they have to give
Pay
two
dowry.
dowries. But have you done a study on the state of Kerala?
Oh yes, I know about Kerala.
90% of the state of Kerala has the highest percentage of educated people.
And also female labor force participation, okay? And they also have had more years of a welfare state than any other state in India. They had all these decades of a communist government that provided free health care, etc., etc. And now, a lot of the people in Kerala have, because they're educated, they have been working in different countries, sending back remittances to Kerala. But the main ethnic group, the dominant ethnic group, which is about 20% of the population in Kerala, are the Nayar, who are matrilineal, and they were a warrior. You are, no kidding. Yeah, so that was, it was a warrior group, and the women would stay home, and the men would come home occasionally, and the women had sexual freedom, and they controlled resources because the group was matrilineal. So Kerala is very different than the rest of India, and yes, I have studied it, and I've had students from Kerala who've worked with me.
Okay, any other last comments before we...
Yeah, I just have a comment / question for Ray. So there's this article that was published in the British Medical Journal last week, and it benchmarks the impact of the reduction in cancer rates and cardiovascular disease rates on longevity, and positively they say, especially in rich countries, there has been life expectancy gains as a result of the drop in cancer. And however, in poor countries, although there were some gains in life expectancy, the gains only tended to include men but not women. They say women in poorer countries have actually experienced losses in life expectancy between 40 and 84 due to two cancers that are not managed very well: breast cancer and lung cancer.
What about cervical cancer? That also.
They said cervical cancer has been on a decline.
Okay.
But lung and
breast,
and they think that is because of the progression of gender inequality. Equality.
Okay. All right. When you're saying low-income countries, you include a wide range of gender equality and inequality.
Yes.
In general, some of the poorest are also some of the most gender unequal. Okay. And if that's the case, then what you're saying is that where the women are not considered to be economically important, they are given much less in the way of health care. And in the ones that have kinship and property systems on the male side, if the woman is not working, the husband is very reluctant, or the male head of household is very reluctant to pay for her medical care. And so, whereas if it's a son, let's say, or the husband, or the father, the grandfather, they will be immediately taken for treatment. If it's a daughter or a wife or something like that, they'll delay. And they'll wait to see if it gets worse. And by waiting to see if it gets worse, if it's cancer, she dies. Now, lung cancer is not so much from smoking in these poor countries. It's from the particulates that get into the lungs, from indoor pollution. Remember, we worked on that. And there are particles that are really tiny that get into the lungs and that are that lead to various kinds of diseases. The COPD, things like emphysema and things like that, as well as lung cancer in women who've never smoked a cigarette in their life, but every day are cooking at an open fire. And the particulates that are given off are of a size that easily pass into the lungs and can cause lung cancer. So I'm not familiar with that particular study, but that is a possible hypothesis. And as far as breast cancer is concerned, that is typically something that you see death coming because it was neglected for too long. And if a woman has a lump and they say, oh, well, we'll see, maybe it'll go away. And that kind of thing happens where women are considered to be economically relatively useless, because otherwise they would be valued enough that they would be taken, or they themselves would go for medical attention. So where you find fatalities from breast cancer, it very often is a tip-off of the low position of women and their low economic power. They have no money to go to the doctor on their own, and their families consider them economic liabilities, not assets. And because early detection of breast cancer, and you get minimal statistics of death and 5-year survival rates. It's now very high in all the advanced countries, or any country where diagnosis is, while it's no more than stage 2, okay? And that means that there are enough signs by then. Usually there's a lump, et cetera, et cetera. But where it's ignored is usually in the countries where the position of women is worst. Does that help?
Yeah?
Okay, thank you very much, Ray.
Okay.